A simple woman tries to open a bank account and is rejected, until a millionaire guarantees her fortune in front of everyone. Laughter echoed through the bank's marble lobby like sharp blades against the skin. A plain woman in worn clothes held a crumpled envelope containing her few documents, while the manager, with a cold smile, announced loudly for all to hear, "Unfortunately, we don't have that type of account for people without a banking history." The entire line turned to her, some murmuring, others chuckling quietly, and a young man in an impeccable suit recorded the scene with his cell phone as if it were a cheap show. Her face flushed, her hands trembled, but her eyes remained steady. There were no tears, only a heavy silence, as if she carried a dignity no one could comprehend. In that moment, she didn't seem invisible. She seemed targeted, and everyone from the security guard to the receptionist seemed to be enjoying her public embarrassment. Before the echo of laughter could fade, a firm voice rang out, "I'll guarantee her account. Put it all in my name." The entire room fell silent, as if the air had been knocked out of it. A tall man in a tailored suit, with a sure step and a magnetic presence, walked among the people. It was Richard Donovan, the millionaire whose face graced magazine covers and whose donations kept entire schools open. The entire bank bowed in instant deference. The manager, who seconds before had mocked the woman, was now sweating. Nervously, almost stuttering. The young man's cell phone camera dropped, trembling. Richard looked at no one but her. "It doesn't matter how much money she has. I'm telling you she's trustworthy." The silence turned to collective embarrassment. Those who had laughed now looked away. Those who had filmed it hastily deleted it, and she, who had been humiliated minutes before, was now the only one holding her head high, unable to understand why a man like that would defend her. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. New York breathed hustle and bustle around every corner, but in this particular neighborhood, far from the glass skyscrapers that reflected power and wealth, the streets had a different rhythm. There were second-hand shops, coffee shops, where the smell of burnt coffee mingled with car exhaust, and a bank with an imposing facade that clashed with the simplicity of its surroundings. The building, with tall columns and polished glass doors, seemed to rise up as a symbol that within it only a few were allowed to fully exist. People hurried past, ignoring the female figure walking with restrained steps, clutching to her chest an envelope that seemed to contain not only documents, but also a whole piece of her hope. Her worn coat clashed with the cold, sophisticated surroundings, and her worn shoes made an irregular sound against the marble entrance. She entered as if apologizing for taking up space, observing the chandeliers shining above and the impeccably dressed staff behind the counter. Inside, everything exuded discreet wealth. The icy air conditioning, the expensive perfume that seemed to permeate the leather chairs, the hurried glances of men in suits carrying briefcases stuffed with figures. Among them, there was always a pattern: confident gestures, firm voices, unhesitating steps. Yet when their eyes fell on the simply dressed woman, there was a stark contrast. She seemed out of place, like a displaced piece of a perfect puzzle. The line moved. Slowly, as she mentally rehearsed what she would say, repeating it under her breath like a silent prayer. "I need to open an account. Just one account." Behind her, two women giggled quietly, whispering about the faded bag she was carrying. The security guard watched her leisurely, with that typical look of someone who measures every detail, as if he already knew she didn't belong there. But it was finally at the counter that the difference became apparent. The manager, a woman in a tight blazer, impeccable makeup and a practiced smile, looked up from her paperwork only to scan her from head to toe. It was the kind of look that needed no words. It carried judgment, impatience, and even a hint of contempt hidden behind formality. She opened the envelope carefully, as if each document were too fragile to bear the weight of being there. Old certificates, a worn ID card, a hand-scrawled proof of address from the landlord of the boarding house where she lived. Nothing seemed shiny enough to compete with the leather folders of previous clients. Still, her eyes didn't waver. There was a quiet courage in her posture, as if this were a battle greater than any other. Because opening a simple account wasn't just a banking service, it was a chance to truly exist in a world that rejected her. It was a first step. Meanwhile, in one of the glass-enclosed offices above, someone was watching. A stiff-backed man, speaking softly on the phone, paused for a moment in his negotiations to look toward the lobby. From above, the scene was clearly visible, the woman alone in the face of indifference. Her fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, but her eyes never wavered. It was Richard Donovan, the millionaire few ever saw up close, but whose name was repeated in headlines, society columns, and charity bulletins. To everyone there, he was merely a distant symbol of power, but to him, in that moment, the scene below seemed to carry a different weight. The lobby continued its usual rhythm, lines, murmurs, hurried service, but there was something suspended in the air, as if this small invisible battle between a simple woman and the cold machine of the system was about to become much more than just a failed attempt to open an account. Her name was Emily Carter, and her life seemed written on pages most people would be ashamed to carry. She grew up in a forgotten Detroit neighborhood, where houses had broken windows, streetlights flickered like nighttime ghosts, and children learned early to survive on little. Her mother, a seamstress with calloused hands, worked miracles to put food on the table. Her father, a truck driver, left when she was just 7, leaving behind debts, broken promises, and the emptiness of absence. From then on, Emily learned that the world had no room for fragility. At 12, she was already working in fast food restaurants to help out at home. School was more of a struggle than an opportunity, as old clothes and worn-out shoes were. Constant teasing. Her classmates laughed at her lunchbox of stale bread, and her teachers saw her as just another student destined to disappear into the statistics. Still, Emily never let shame shape her. In the silence of the night, hidden in her small room with peeling walls, she read the used book she borrowed from the community library. There, among yellowed pages, I dreamed of a life where I could make my own choices. When her mother fell ill, Emily's adolescence became a race against time. She worked double shifts, cleaning offices at night and waiting tables during the day, while caring for her mother as she slowly withered away. She watched neighbors offer words of comfort, but none truly extended a helping hand. She learned that deep down, no one was there to save anyone. And when her mother passed away, Emily was left alone in the world, with only a suitcase of clothes and the echo of the last words she had heard. Don't let life make you believe you don't deserve more. From then on, everything became survival. She slept on acquaintances' couches, rented rooms in cheap boarding houses, and worked exhausting temporary jobs, but she never gave up saving small sums in hidden envelopes. Each coin represented a promise that one day she would have something of her own. But reality seemed to mock her efforts. Every time she saved a little, a new emergency arose, a late rent, a hospital bill, a boss who disappeared without paying. Still, Emily carried an almost stubborn faith. She believed that somehow her life wasn't meant to end in anonymity. Each late night spent working, each humiliation swallowed in silence, became a brick in an invisible wall she built around herself. It wasn't pride, it was resistance. Now, as she entered that elegant bank, she wasn't just carrying documents. She carried with her the weight of a story of abandonment and pain, but also of perseverance. To many there, she was just a poor woman trying to open an account. For Emily, however, that gesture meant proving to the world and to herself that there was still room for her name, that there was still dignity to be gained. The line moved with the slowness typical of a bank on a Monday morning. Emily took a deep breath, mentally repeating every word she'd prepared to avoid stuttering. When she finally reached the counter, she carefully handed over her papers, almost as if offering something sacred. The manager, however, didn't look up immediately. She simply hurriedly leafed through the documents, as if dealing with an inconvenience, and then looked up with that artificial smile. "Would you like to open an account?" she asked loudly, drawing glances from those nearby. Emily nodded, feeling a blush rise to her face. The manager examined the hand-scribbled proof of address, the worn ID, the crumpled papers. Her smile turned into something between mockery and impatience. Unfortunately, without a banking history, without official proof, we can't open an account. This information isn't valid. Her voice was louder than it should have been, and a few people around her chuckled quietly. A young man in a suit, clearly a long-time customer, muttered to the woman next to him, "Look at this. It's like a scene from a cheap movie." She laughed, covering her mouth with her hand but without hiding her contempt. Emily tried to argue. "But I get paid in cash. I just need an account to deposit my salary." The manager sighed, leaning forward. "Ma'am, this bank isn't for everyone. We deal with serious clients here with track records, stability and guarantees. Without that, there's nothing I can do." The silence that followed was broken by a voice in the background. A young customer, perhaps wanting to impress friends, commented loudly, "Want to bet she doesn't even have $50 in her purse?" Laughter erupted, rippling through the lobby. Emily flinched, but kept her eyes steady, as if refusing to fall. The manager, sensing the mood, didn't try to calm her down. Instead, she lifted her chin and with subtle irony said, "Well, ma'am, if you really have the funds to open the account, show it here, now. Prove to everyone that you deserve to be at this counter." It was a cruel invitation, a bet disguised as formal procedure. Emily opened her purse with trembling hands. Inside was a smaller envelope, filled with carefully folded bills, the sum of months of hard work, sleepless nights, and skipped meals to save money. When he began to fold the bills, some laughed louder. "Look at that cash, just like a drug dealer," someone muttered. The security guard smirked. The scene had become a public spectacle, and every glance carried the weight of judgment. She placed the money on the counter. It wasn't much, but to her it meant everything. The manager looked at her, raised her eyebrows, and let out a nasal laugh. "Ma'am, this barely covers a premium account fee, and yet, without valid documents, we can't accept it." The laughter echoed through the room, scattering like sparks on dry straw. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. And it was at that exact moment, as the humiliation was consolidated in front of dozens of witnesses, that destiny prepared to turn the page. The silence that followed the manager's laughter seemed to choke the air in the lobby. Emily still had her hands on the envelope containing the bills, unsure whether to put them back, or simply leave them there. A final gesture of dignity in the face of collective contempt. Eyes focused on her like invisible blades, and each second prolonged the feeling that the entire world was watching her fall. Then, firm footsteps pierced the room. The sound echoed against the marble, slow, rhythmic, as if each shoe tap had been rehearsed to interrupt the scene. Everyone turned at once, and when they saw who was approaching, the whispers ceased. Richard Donovan strode across the lobby, with the ease of someone already bearing the weight of power. His impeccable suit, his discreetly aligned tie, his straight shoulders, everything about him exuded authority. But it wasn't just his appearance. He had an almost magnetic presence that silenced even the most arrogant of people. The manager, once imperious behind the counter, swallowed hard and straightened her blazer, as if she'd suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Richard didn't look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on Emily. He stopped a few steps away and took in the scene. The bills scattered on the counter, the woman in simple clothes struggling to resist her embarrassment, and the leering glances that dispersed as soon as he met their gaze. The silence grew heavy, almost suffocating, until he finally spoke, his voice firm and effortless. "Open her account. Immediately." The manager blinked rapidly, astonished. Mr. Donovan, I don't know if you understand, but there are no valid documents and—" He interrupted her without raising his voice, but with a precision that cut like a blade. "I said open her account. Everything she needs will be guaranteed in my name." The sentence echoed through the room like a thunderclap. The laughter ceased completely. The young man filming on his cell phone, previously laughing, lowered the screen in despair, deleting the video before it was too late. The security guard straightened his posture, trying to appear professional. Emily, however, didn't move a muscle. Her eyes met Richard's, and for a second, it seemed as if the whole world disappeared. There were no benches, no witnesses, no laughter. Just that direct gaze, filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Not pity, not curiosity, but a kind of silent recognition. As if, somehow, he saw something beyond the worn clothes and crumpled papers. The manager, trembling, tried to regain control. If it's Mr. Donovan's wish, we can... Of course, we can arrange it immediately. The tone of her voice had changed. The same counter that had previously rejected Emily with contempt now bent in servitude. It was as if the walls of the bank had bowed before a single man's command. Richard approached the counter, picked up the envelope containing the bills, and handed it back to Emily. "Keep this, money doesn't prove someone's worth." The simple yet symbolically charged gesture left everyone in an uncomfortable silence. This woman, who minutes before had been the butt of ridicule, was now under the protection of one of the most powerful men in the country. And this sudden turnaround didn't seem impulsive. In Richard's eyes, there was something more. A hidden flame, a memory perhaps. Emily, still confused, could only whisper, "Why?" The question hung in the air, but Richard didn't answer. He simply held her gaze for a few seconds and then turned to the manager. "I want the best services available for her. Treat her as you would treat me." And without waiting for an answer, he took a step back as if he had closed the subject. But to everyone present it was clear that had been just the beginning. The weight of Richard's order hung in the air like a decree impossible to dispute. The manager, still blushing, began shuffling through the papers, asking the clerk next to her to open the account with top priority. But the mood hadn't completely changed. The whispers returned, quieter, more venomous. People who had laughed openly minutes before now cast sidelong glances, as if searching for an explanation for the millionaire's unexpected gesture. Some murmured that it was excessive charity, others that he must be hiding some agenda. The young man who had been filming couldn't resist the venom. He muttered, loud enough for more than one person to hear, "She must be one of his protégés. No one gives that kind of attention for free." The comment spread like wildfire, and soon other eyes narrowed, assessing Emily as if she'd accepted an illicit favor. The humiliation, previously evident in laughter, was now disguised as innuendo and leering looks. Emily felt each gaze like a weight on her shoulders. Her breathing quickened, but she remained still, determined not to lower her head. Richard, a few steps away, seemed oblivious to the whispers, but he wasn't naive. He knew every word uttered there carried the force of a wound. Still, he let the silence stretch, as if waiting for the tension itself to expose the hypocrisy of the atmosphere. The manager, trying to regain authority, said with a nervous smile, "Mr. Donovan, we'll open her account immediately, but understand, this bank has a reputation to uphold. Perhaps Mrs. Carter would prefer a popular bank, more suited to her profile." It was a stab disguised as kindness. The sweet tone hid the same initial contempt. Some customers nodded, almost laughing. It was as if to say, "She may have his support, but she will never be one of us." Richard didn't answer. He just stared at her coldly, and the silence was more devastating than any words. The manager looked away, swallowing her own arrogance. Emily, however, realized something even more painful. She wasn't just the manager. The customers viewed her as an intruder, as someone who had crossed a forbidden border. Richard's presence protected her, but it also isolated her. It was as if, instead of gaining a place, she had been forced into it, and now she was seen as a fraud. When the clerk brought the papers and asked her to sign, Emily gripped the pen tightly. The murmur in the room grew louder. "Look at that, signing a contract like someone important. A beggar suddenly becomes a premium client." The words weren't spoken directly to her, but were thrown through the air like invisible stones. Emily signed without trembling. She put away the documents they handed her, and as she stood, she felt the eyes burning into her skin again. There was no applause, no recognition, just a dense silence, broken by discreet giggles. To everyone there, she wasn't a woman who had earned a right. She was an outsider, an anomaly, someone who was only there because a powerful man had decided so. The humiliation was no longer at the counter, but in the collective judgment. And that somehow hurt even more. Richard watched silently, his eyes fixed on her. But Emily already knew. This wasn't the end of the shame. It was just the first layer of a game that was yet to begin. Emily let the scene unfold unhurriedly. She accepted the new account documents, carefully tucked them into her worn purse, and just as everyone thought she would leave quietly, she lifted her head and looked around. Her eyes met, one by one, the faces that had judged her. There was no hatred, no fury, just an almost disturbing calm. It was then that her voice, calm but firm, broke the air. "Funny, everyone here laughed when they thought I had nothing. But no one realized that from the beginning, I knew exactly what was going to happen." The silence grew even heavier. The manager's eyes widened, uncomprehending. "What do you mean? You knew?" Emily took a deep breath, adjusting her coat on her shoulders, and continued. "It's not the first time you've looked at me like that. I've seen that smile. I've seen that look that determines who deserves to exist here and who doesn't. I came prepared for this. I knew you would treat me as if I were invisible, as if I were less than. But what you didn't know is that I'd seen this place before, long before I walked in here today." The whispers resumed, now filled with unease. Richard watched silently, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to understand how far this revelation would lead. Emily lifted the envelope of money, opening it slightly. "This money, you called it little, insignificant, but each bill here carries a price none of you have ever paid. Each represents sleepless nights, days without food, months without giving up. And lest you think I arrived here unaware of what I would face, know that I chose this bank on purpose. I knew I wouldn't be welcome. I wanted to see how far your arrogance would go." Her words cut like silent razors. The manager tried to maintain her composure, but the blush on her face betrayed her discomfort. One of the customers, the same one who had made jokes minutes before, looked away, biting his lip. Emily continued, "I knew they would laugh, mock, make insinuations. I've experienced this before, in every classroom where I was. The poor one. In every job interview where they laughed at my outfit. On every street corner where they said I wouldn't make it past 20 without losing my way. I knew it, and yet I walked in. The lobby was still. Even the clerks pretended to type to avoid the weight of the words. Emily turned her eyes to Richard, who stared at her in absolute silence. Then she said, almost in a whisper that echoed louder than a shout, "What you don't know is that it's not me who's being tested here. It's you." For a moment, no one breathed. It was as if the marble walls, the imposing columns, and the sparkling chandeliers had shrunk before the steadfastness of that simple woman. She had turned humiliation into a tribunal, and, without accusing anyone directly, she had condemned everyone with her own truth. Richard remained motionless, as if every word Emily spoke had penetrated layers of silence within him. It wasn't just her courage that impressed him, but the way she seemed to have anticipated. Every look, every gesture, every word in the room. He watched intently, trying to place that simple figure in some distant memory, but something still eluded him. Until later, when she had already left the counter and was walking toward the exit, Richard called her by her full name, Emily Carter, pronounced with a confidence that stopped her in her tracks. She turned slowly, surprised, her eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" Richard held her gaze, his mind working like ancient gears. Suddenly remembering a rhythm, Emily didn't respond. She simply maintained the silence that so disturbed those trying to decipher her. It was then that he discreetly asked his assistant to investigate. A few hours later, in his office, he received a quick dossier on the woman who had shaken the bank that morning. As Richard flipped through the pages, he discovered that Emily wasn't just a simple woman looking to settle a bill. Her last name, Carter, was linked to an old case, forgotten by the newspapers, but not by him. Her father, a truck driver, had worked years ago for one of the trucking companies subcontracted by a company within the Donovan group itself. There were records of labor lawsuits, unpaid debts, accidents covered up by high-powered lawyers. Richard vaguely remembered the cold negotiations made to silence families who had lost everything. And now, before him, stood the daughter of one of those invisible men, someone who had grown up amid the ruins of a system from which he himself had benefited. Richard closed the file and remained silent for several long minutes. The memory came back vividly. A thin boy with greasy hands, waiting for his father outside a warehouse. He himself, as a young man, had seen this scene before taking over the family business. He wasn't a complete stranger. He remembered that face. Now, years later, standing before Emily, it all made sense. She not only knew how she would be treated, but also somehow knew the weight her surname carried. Richard's heart clenched with something rare, guilt. For the first time in a long time, his fortune seemed to have a bitter echo, because Emily's life, her struggle, her pain were directly linked to a past he had inherited without question. The irony was devastating. The man now defending her before the bank was, in part, heir to the same machine that had destroyed his family's dignity. In that instant, Richard understood that his intervention had not been coincidental. There was something greater, almost inevitable, that had pushed him into that scene. And Emily's steady gaze, filled with quiet dignity, wasn't just resistance, it was also a reminder. It was as if she were a mirror of what he had ignored for years. After that day at the bank, Emily disappeared like a shadow melting into the sunrise. She left no phone number, no address, no trace other than a timid signature on the account opening papers. To most, she was just another customer lost among so many numbers. But for Richard, her absence became a suffocating presence. In the days that followed, he tried to find her discreetly. He sent assistants to search, combed through records of cheap boarding houses in distant neighborhoods, but everything seemed to unravel before his eyes. Emily was an enigma that refused to be deciphered. What disturbed him most was that, for the first time in years, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. He was accustomed to people seeking him out of self-interest, begging for favors, circling his life in search of power. But Emily had done the opposite. After receiving his protection, she simply left. Her absence grew in his mind like a silent wound. In business meetings, the executive's words seemed distant, as if they were speaking from another world. On lonely nights in his glass penthouse, he found himself mentally replaying the scene at the bank. Her steady gaze, the truth-laden words that had silently shattered everyone. It was an uncomfortable and, at the same time, necessary memory. Richard felt something he had never felt before, a lack, not just of her physical presence but of the brutal honesty she carried. Emily hadn't treated him as an untouchable man, hadn't bowed to his power. On the contrary, she had exposed her own scars before him without asking for anything in return. That was what disturbed him, the purity of a resistance that couldn't be bought. Over time, the absence turned into restlessness. She began frequenting the same poor neighborhoods she'd previously only seen in passing in philanthropy reports. She'd drive through narrow streets, watch children playing on cracked sidewalks, see mothers carrying heavy bags after exhausting shifts. She'd search, without telling anyone, for any sign of her. But Emily wouldn't appear. It was as if she'd been swallowed by her own silence. The newspapers continued to plaster his face in society columns, associating him with parties, investments, and million-dollar deals. But behind the facade, Richard was different. That absence gnawed at him more than any financial defeat. Because for the first time, he wanted to be seen not as the millionaire everyone revered, but as the man who had felt something real with a simple woman who had disappeared without a trace. It was ironic. He, who had access to every luxury and every person, was now haunted by the lack of someone who had nothing. And the more time passed, the clearer the truth became. Emily had taken with her the one thing money couldn't buy, the ability to feel human. The beginning of the downfall didn't come from a declared enemy, but from something more cruel, public opinion. For weeks, the video recorded at the bank, the one the young client had recorded before deleting it, resurfaced on obscure forums and suddenly was all over social media. In it, Emily was seen being exposed, humiliated by the manager, laughed at by customers, and then Richard stepping in to defend her. The video ended abruptly, but it was enough to spark debate. On one side, voices praised the millionaire's generosity. On the other, they questioned his motives. Why would a man like him care about a stranger? That wasn't altruism, it was an act. The headlines gained momentum. The angel of the poor, or just calculated marketing. The Donovan name, which for years had been synonymous with prestige and philanthropy, was now being dragged into vitriolic editorials. Allied executives began to quietly distance themselves, fearing their image would become unstable. In corporate corridors, whispers swirled that Richard had lost control, that his decisions were tainted by dangerous emotional involvement. But the biggest wound came not from the newspapers, but from the boardrooms. Shareholders demanded explanations, accusing him of exposing the group to unnecessary risks. In a heated meeting, one of them raised his voice before everyone. "You, Richard, have always been seen as calculating, but now you act like a teenager, fascinated by a poor woman we don't even know. You're putting decades of legacy at risk for a whim." The phrase, hurled like venom, echoed in the room full of suits. Richard didn't respond immediately, and his silence was interpreted as weakness. The media seized on it. Columns appeared insinuating that Emily was a secret lover, a hidden heiress, or even an accomplice in some scheme. Each rumor fueled the fire, and what had once been solid respect now became shaky ground. The same newspapers that had covered his philanthropy now published caricatures of a deluded man, a millionaire who traded reason for emotion. Richard began to experience something Emily had always known: the silent judgment, the sidelong glances, the doors that closed without warning. Restaurants that once reserved the best tables now greeted him with strained smiles. Invitations to events disappeared. Business partners delayed responses. It was as if, suddenly, he was no longer untouchable. And amidst this storm, Emily's absence weighed even more heavily, because, paradoxically, it was his defense of her that triggered his downfall, but it was also her memory that kept him going. He was beginning to understand, bitterly, that public humiliation doesn't discriminate between class or fortune. At the bank, Emily had borne this burden alone. Now he felt the same blade slash through his skin before society's invisible tribunal. Criticism piled up like stones thrown into a public square. Richard, accustomed to living shielded by power and influence, now felt the weight of the judgment he had previously always escaped. And it was in this vulnerability that the transformation began. The man who spent hours in front of screens with graphs and figures now found himself silent, watching the hustle and bustle of the streets below from his office window. He saw ordinary faces, workers, mothers in a hurry, children with large backpacks, and felt something he usually didn't allow himself to feel: identification. He realized he'd always talked about philanthropy as numbers in reports, but never as real lives. Emily's image kept coming back, a reminder that dignity can't be bought, granted, or recognized. Her silence when he'd asked why at the bank echoed in his mind. Why had he intervened? He didn't know, but now he understood that the gesture wasn't just about her. It was about him, about the need to break free from the invisible prison he lived in, surrounded by sycophants, social conventions, and an inherited legacy that crushed as much as it sustained. Richard began to decline lavish invitations, something unthinkable months before. Instead, he spent his nights in ancient libraries, reading stories of men who lost everything and found themselves. He discreetly visited shelters that he himself funded, but had never actually entered. He sat in silence, listening to stories from people invisible to the world, and each word seemed to peel back another layer of his arrogance. The public downfall that had once humiliated him began to become a necessary mirror. He understood with painful clarity that Emily had represented something no one in his life had dared to show: the raw truth. She didn't fear him, didn't flatter him, didn't seek anything in return. She simply existed before him with a strength no amount of money could buy, and that was what began to heal the part of him that had never been touched, the part that needed to be human before becoming a millionaire. The shareholders, the newspapers, the partners, they all continued to pressure him, but Richard no longer listened to them in the same way. For the first time, The weight of outside opinion seemed less than the need to reconcile with himself. His transformation was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was silent, built on a lingering look at streets he had previously ignored, on the discomfort he felt wearing expensive suits, on the memory of a simple woman who had disappeared, leaving him with the one thing he had always lacked, the truth. And deep down, Richard knew, the search for Emily was no longer just about finding her again. It was about finding himself again. It was on a rainy day that their reunion happened, not like in romantic movies, but with the rawness of real life. Richard had been invited to visit a community school in the countryside, one of many funded by his name. Normally he would send a representative, but in that phase of quiet transformation, he wanted to be there. He arrived early without his usual entourage, carrying only a black umbrella and a visible weariness on his shoulders. As he entered the simple building, where the hallways smelled of chalk and hope, his eyes caught sight of her. Emily was there. Not as a student, not as a beneficiary, but as a volunteer. She organized books on makeshift shelves, spoke to children who followed her with bright eyes, and gave rare smiles, the kind that ask for nothing in return. The impact was immediate. Richard stopped in the hallway, unable to breathe for a few seconds. He hadn't expected to see her, and the scene before him felt stronger than any memory. She saw him. Her steady gaze never wavered. For a moment, time seemed to drag between them, as if all the silence that had accumulated since the bench had condensed into that moment. Emily didn't run to him, didn't smile in recognition, didn't show exaggerated surprise. She simply stared at him, as if she knew fate would eventually bring him here. Richard approached, each step carrying weight. "Emily," he said almost in a whisper, but she raised her hand slightly, signaling silence. There was no room for immediate explanations. The children around her ran, laughing, calling for her. And as she helped one of them hold a heavy book, Emily said without looking directly at Richard, "I knew you'd come eventually. The power you carry won't leave you alone." He swallowed, unable to answer immediately. The simple room seemed more imposing than any luxurious office he had ever inhabited. There, among the worn chairs and barefoot children, Richard felt small before her. He tried to justify himself. "I looked everywhere for you." Emily finally looked at him, and her eyes held neither anger nor sweetness, only a piercing clarity. "I didn't want to be found. You needed to feel the absence. Only then would you learn what it means to be on the other side." The words pierced Richard with the force of a sentence. There was no denying it. She was right. Her absence had transformed him more than any advice, more than any public fall. He wanted to say it all at once, that he had missed her, that his life had lost meaning without that gaze, that her truth was the only real thing left amid so many social lies. But when he opened his mouth, Emily was already walking to the door, ready to leave. However, before crossing the threshold, she stopped. Without turning around, she said, "The reunion isn't the end, Richard. It's the test. And you're still being judged." The rain pounded hard outside, and as she disappeared into the grey mist, Richard understood that this moment wasn't about answers. It was about continuing to bear the weight of the silence she carried like a sword. The reunion at the community school hadn't ended in reconciliation. It hung in the balance like a held breath, and Richard carried that burden for the next few days. He tried to reach out again, but Emily kept her distance. When he appeared, she greeted him politely, without hostility, but also without intimacy. It was as if she were erecting an invisible barrier, reminding him that the final decision wasn't in his hands. The moment of choice came on a cold afternoon when the wind blew hard through the narrow streets of her neighborhood. Emily found him in front of a simple coffee shop, away from the flashes and cameras. He was already there, waiting, with a tired but determined look. When she entered, the silence was immediate. They sat across from each other at a scratched wooden table, without hurried waiters, without distractions. Just the two of them. Richard began speaking, his voice low but filled with a sincerity he rarely displayed. "I didn't know who you were at the bank. I didn't know the story. But when I found out, I realized your pain was part of something my family helped build, and I inherited that guilt. I spent years thinking generosity meant writing checks, but you showed me otherwise. You forced me to see what I'd always avoided. Emily listened silently, her eyes fixed on him. She waited for him to finish before responding. I didn't need your protection on that bench, Richard. I knew I would be humiliated. I knew they would laugh. I wanted to face it, not be saved. But you intervened. And since then, everything has changed. The weight isn't in your defending me. It's in what it meant for all of us. Because in the end, your voice silenced mine. And I don't know if I can forgive that. The silence after his words was devastating. Richard leaned in, his voice trembling. I don't want to erase your voice. I want to hear it. I'm not the same man who walked into that bank. But I don't know if I can prove that to you. Emily took a deep breath, and for the first time her eyes softened. Proof isn't with words, Richard. It's with what you do when no one's looking. I don't need you. I never have. The question is, do you need me? Or do you just need to soothe your own guilt? The words hung like a sentence. Richard lowered his eyes, knowing the question was bigger than he could answer at that moment. Emily stood slowly, placing her hands on the table as if firming her resolve. He watched her, his heart racing, unsure of what would come next. Then she said with the calm of someone who had already chosen, I won't hate you, but I won't lose myself in you either. If one day our paths cross again, it will be because fate willed it. Until then, carry on without trying to carry me. Because I'll carry on without you. Emily left the cafeteria without looking back. Richard remained seated, motionless, feeling that those words weren't just a farewell. They were also a final judgment. The rain had stopped, but the city ground still reflected the streetlights, like fragments of a broken world. Richard walked alone, without bodyguards, without luxury cars, only with the weight of the silence Emily had left behind. He passed shop windows, where mannequins sported suits identical to his, but for the first time he didn't recognize himself. He stopped in front of the bank where it all began. The now empty lobby greeted him with a cold echo. He walked to the counter, placed his hand on the icy marble, and remained there, motionless, remembering the laughter, the looks, the humiliation that once wasn't his, and was now part of him. Across town, Emily closed the door to her small room, placing the envelope of documents on the table. The open account wasn't a victory, nor a prize. It was merely a symbol, proof that her dignity didn't need to be granted by anyone. She lit a simple candle, let the flame illuminate the peeling wall, and took a deep breath as if closing a cycle. That same night, Richard left a blank check on his desk. He didn't sign it, didn't fill it out, just left it there, as if relinquishing the power that had always defined him. Then he turned out the lights and stood at the window, gazing at the city that, for the first time, seemed bigger than him. There was no immediate reunion, no explicit forgiveness, no final explanations, just two paths that had crossed and now moved on in silence, each marked by the other. And in the silence of the city, there seemed to be an invisible justice, not the justice of courts or of figures, but the poetic justice that takes hold when life returns to each person the reflection they always tried to avoid. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.